Besides reducing the trade deficit with China, Trump also wants to eliminate the root cause of unfair trade, a structural change in trade and, in a sense, how China runs its economy. Will China make those changes?
不会的，共产党政府呢又绝不会主动地减弱自己对社会的控制能力。
China's trade team is also divided. Can Liu He, China's vice premier, persuade Xi Jinping to make concessions?
刘鹤主和只是一个传闻，目前他表现出的妥协程度也是有限的。比如说在取消出口补贴这类事情上，他就没有退让。
China still depends too much on exports, which makes it vulnerable. Can China transform into a consumption-based economy?
Welcome to Zooming In. I'm Simone Gao. The US-China trade talks have gone through quite a few ups and downs and unexpected turns in the past 2 months. I remember hearing experts from both countries predicting how the trade war would never happen because both sides had too much to lose. It turned out they were wrong. The Trump administration is committed to making substantial changes in US-China trade relations. More importantly, they did not shy away from the root cause of unfair trade. That root cause is all about how the Chinese Communist regime runs its business. It's reflected in currency manipulation, import quotas, intellectual property theft, unfair subsidies to its state-owned enterprises, and many other areas. By pushing changes in these areas, I wonder if the Trump administration realizes that they might be doing the Chinese people a favor in the long run as well, because these changes are long overdue reforms that will actually benefit the private sector and average Chinese consumers, instead of the rich and powerful who run the country. No doubt it will be hard. The way the Chinese Communist regime runs its economy is never just about economics. It's also a political issue, and it's about the stability and survival of communist rule. So far, there's been no sign that they are willing to change. But the gloomy prospect of a full-blown trade war and the impact on their regime's stability might force the party to make certain concessions. We discuss these questions in this episode of Zooming In.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross went to China earlier this month for the third round of high-level trade talks.
Secretary Ross, how close are we to a deal?
Mr. Ross also wanted to strike a deal, but that didn't happen. A week before, the White House renewed earlier threats to impose 25% tariffs on $50 billion in Chinese goods. That complicated Mr. Ross's mission to secure a settlement with Beijing. China offered to purchase nearly $70 billion of U.S. farm manufacturing and energy products, only if the Trump administration abandons the renewed tariffs. President Trump requested a $200 billion trade deficit reduction. This $70 billion offer would constitute a big portion of that. It also targets President Trump's base in the Farm Belt states. The energy products come from states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, which are important for the midterm elections. However, the White House is reluctant to make that concession at this point. Larry Kudlow, the White House chief economic advisor, explained in a briefing that the trade tensions between the two countries is not just about soybeans and natural gas.
This is not a government to government. This is not the Chinese government buying a bunch of natural gas and soybeans from America. This is about reducing tariff rates and non-tariff barriers that will permit the increase in U.S. export sales to China. That's the actual mechanism. And I don't think that's been a clear point. It's an economic point. That's how you do it. And that represents structural change, important structural change. Now,
it represents structural change in the U.S.-China trade mechanism. But more importantly, it requests structural changes in China's economy. China's trade surplus is only one result of unfair trade between the two parties. The Trump administration seeks more than just reducing the surplus. It seeks to eliminate the cause of unfair trade. The causes include theft of intellectual property, forceful transfer of technology, tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, such as restrictions in foreign investment and other discriminative regulations, as well as the Chinese government's unfair subsidies to its state-owned enterprises. None of these can be fixed by more soybeans and natural gas. If China makes changes in those areas, it would change how the communist regime runs its economy. Strategies such as subsidizing state-owned technological enterprises are at the core of Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025 initiative. These are not easy concessions for China to make.
The Trump administration's requirements demand a structural change to China's economy. How will these changes affect communist rule? Let's hear my discussion with senior political commentator Wen Zhao. 美国所要求的改变，例如 the U.S. demanded changes involve the theft of intellectual property rights, forced technology transfer, restrictions on import quotas, and favoring domestic tech firms. To meet these requirements, what does China need to do with its economic structure? How will these changes react upon China's political system?
其实你上面所说的内容都包括在结构。
All you have mentioned are included in structural factors. China's huge, long-standing trade surplus is not a result of competitive advantages in particular sectors, nor is it caused by seasonal interim factors. Rather, it has benefited from export advantages due to China's decades-long legal and policy practices. Large-scale export subsidies, import quotas, unfair tariffs, unwilling intellectual property transfer all constitute structural causes to the huge long-term trade surplus. Other factors include state-decided foreign exchange rates, state-mastered pricing power of all market elements for land and labor. All these privileges of the Chinese Communist regime can be transferred into low-price advantages in exports. What trade talks can achieve at most is change particular structural factors, say reducing tariffs, lifting import quotas. Fundamentally, they hardly work for balancing trade on both sides. The Chinese regime enjoys such advantages as long as it remains authoritarian. If it loses them, it ceases to be a centralized government.
So China won't make these changes.
No, it may cut down import tariffs and eliminate import quotas or lift investment restrictions on particular sectors. However, it can invent new forms of barriers because it grips all power and all domestic social networks in its hand. For example, milk powder. Despite its lowered import tariffs, Chinese agents and distributors keep a very low proportion of imported milk powder because their government wants it that way to ramp up its prices. So foreign milk powder remains a very limited share in the Chinese market. In other words, it may dismantle its tangible customs and then set new, intangible ones against you. So theoretically, the Chinese government monopolizes the final pricing power for all goods within China. This is unimaginable for other nations. Because the Chinese regime is just such an authority, it has such microscopic control power over all of its society, as deep as one's capillaries. Any results achieved from the negotiation table are volatile, no long-term guarantee, and the regime will never reduce its control over its society willingly.
Coming up, China's leaders are divided on the trade war. Who will win? And will China fight to the end?
Whoever is more powerful is more likely to win a fight. It's also usually true that the person with less to lose will be more willing to fight. Let's hear what White House Director of Trade Policy, Peter Navarro, has to say about this in the Fox News interview from June 3rd.
I get that. I want to ask you about China because here's the headline of the morning in terms of China. I'm reading an article right now, and it says China says all trade progress is off if the U.S. imposes these tariffs. Are we willing to throw away the relationship that we have with China to push tariffs and restrictions on the country?
Well, let's look at the relationship we have with China. We have a $371 billion trade deficit in goods, which basically ships off 2 million manufacturing jobs to China every year. That's not so good. We had General Mattis talking about the activity in the South China Sea with respect to China building up all their their artificial islands. And of course, the big issue that we're fighting, the president is fighting with Ambassador Lighthizer, is this theft of our crown jewels of technology. They take our technology, Maria. Everybody knows they steal it, but they also force the transfer of it. They evade our export controls, and they're coming over here, the Chinese state-owned enterprises coming over here with bags full of money and buying up places like Silicon Valley. So that's a relationship with China that structurally needs to change. We'd love to have a peaceful and friendly relationship with China, but we also are standing firm on the idea.
Mr. Navarro represents the most hawkish view regarding the trade war with China. That's one side of the supposedly divided U.S. trade team. But media in the U.S. isn't paying attention to the possibility of an equally divided Chinese team. If they are also divided, how would that affect the trade talks?
Liu He is China's vice premier and a Politburo member. He is also an economist who holds an MBA from Harvard University. He serves as Xi's chief economic advisor and leads the Chinese team in U.S.-China trade negotiations. According to an Apple Daily article, Liu is in favor of making concessions to America. He believes a trade war will be disastrous to China and cannot be won. He gives 3 reasons. First, it is China who violated international trade rules and is responsible for intellectual property theft. It lost the moral ground from the very beginning. Secondly, China isn't able to engage in a full-blown trade war with the U.S. because it imports a relatively small amount of U.S. goods. China can only retaliate against the amount of U.S. goods exported to China. However, America is one of China's biggest export markets, and the U.S. could punish China to a larger degree. Thirdly, all imported Chinese products to the U.S. can be substituted. Some of them were produced by the U.S. originally, but a large portion of the goods imported from the U.S. are essential to China's economic lifeline. Proponents of the trade war are not clear about trade. A general understanding is that party members, whose only education and training come from the Communist Party itself, tend to believe the Chinese Communist regime is invincible.
Can Liu He persuade Chinese President Xi Jinping? This is what Wen Zhao has to say. 刘鹤是习近平信赖的人. As Xi Jinping's staunch trust, Liu He favors concessions to America. But the U.S. demands are a direct attack to Xi's Made in China 2025.
It is just a rumor that Liu favors concessions. So far, he's shown limited compromise and hasn't made concessions in lifting export subsidies. Further, in that setting of the Chinese regime, it is impossible for Liu, as the head of Chinese trade team, to suggest fully accepting American terms, or he would be in the crossfire of his political rivals and would be in danger himself. Xi, of course, won't make concessions regarding Made in China 2025. That's a crucial part of his life's goal. He envisions a material increase in China's military and technological firepower around 2030, and mainland China being the world's #1 power around 2050. In his blueprint, his Made in China 2025 is of vital significance. Therefore, Xi would never bow on Made in China 2025 unless he is hit by substantial setbacks and his strategic objectives have to be readjusted.
To believe in trade war or not, what effect will they have on the Chinese people?
Once a trade war erupts, China's consumer price index will be driven up because the U.S. farm products will be retaliated. For example, increased soybean prices will lead to increased edible oil prices or to a roiled market by low-quality edible oil, and increased fodder prices will push up meat prices too. If the trade war plays into the broader scale affecting goods worth $150 billion, almost all American exports to China will be covered, including products which China has difficulty getting from other suppliers. Then China's economy will be materially harmed. Also, if China's goods worth $150 billion are barred from the American market, Chinese businesses will have to consider price drops and transfer them to other countries whose own markets will be disrupted, causing a chain reaction. In a word, a tariff war on goods worth $50 billion will be less harmful to either side. but that on goods worth 150 billion will substantially harm China, which is more dependent on exports and whose lost trade volume is hard to regain from elsewhere. If that situation can be averted, China will tune down its tariffs on imports, which will certainly benefit its consumers. However, lower tariffs don't necessarily mean lower final retail prices. Their actual effects need a wait and see.
Coming up, can China transform into a consumption-based economy?
One of the main reasons China is more vulnerable in a trade war is because China still depends too much on exports. Can China change this and transform into a consumption-driven economy? Let's see what's wrong with China's domestic consumption.
According to World Bank data from 2017, private consumption made up close to 70% of the U.S. GDP. In comparison, China's private consumption was only 39% of China's GDP. That leaves China near the bottom globally. Although it has improved 4% since 2010, it's not enough to support China's export-dependent economy. As China's wealth grows, Chinese consumers should have more to spend, but China is still far away from reaching 70% like the U.S., according to a report published by Southwestern School of Economics. Housing accounts for 68% of a Chinese family's wealth. In Beijing and Shanghai, it is as high as 85%. It suggests that much of Chinese consumers' wealth increase is tied up in fixed properties.
Can China morph into a consumption-oriented economy? Let's hear from Wen Zhao again. A simple question. Can China shake up its domestic consumption?
To put it simply, yes. These years have seen a continuing rise in domestic consumption ratio in China's GDP, but not high enough to meet its economic growth goals. Causes inherent in China's system bar its domestic purchasing power from rising. For example, Chinese lack well-developed social security, so they have to put aside higher savings against risks of unemployment and illness. Also, unfairly distributed educational resources force Chinese urban residents into investing considerably for their children's education, which curbs their consumption. Further, once China's risks, real estate bubbles and local government debts, turn into reality, as a crisis, the Chinese people will suffer immeasurable wealth loss. So there's a long way ahead for China to form a domestic consumer market vigorous enough to back its fast-growing economy. Conclusively, what the Chinese regime can count on is still government-led investments in foreign trade.
The U.S.-China trade war is an important event in our times. It means someone is finally addressing the elephant in the room before it's too late. Reinstalling order in the world economic system would not only benefit America, but also the rest of the world, including the Chinese people in the long run. In the Trump era, as White House Trade Policy Director Peter Navarro puts it, the days of accepting unfair trade practices are over. I hope that's true. He also said there will continue to be a strong need to cooperate on issues of mutual interest, including defending democracy and freedom against authoritarianism. We don't hear these words very often anymore, so I take it as a positive change. Thanks for watching Zooming In. I'm Simone Gao. See you next week.